This unit of S244, Field Observer and Fire Effects Monitor, presents a short lesson on the preparation of reports and summaries for fire monitoring. Upon completion of this unit, students will be familiar with reporting formats to document observations of weather, fire behavior, smoke production, and fire effects using existing forms, document the comparisons of predicted fire behavior, fire effects, and weather to observed and prescribed conditions, describe in narrative format how closely wildland fire management objectives were met, and document follow-up actions as needed. The objectives for this unit are directly related to these tasks in the FEMO-FOBS Position Taskbook. Task number 12. Provide monitoring summary for assigned area. The bulleted items for this task are compare observed fire behavior and effects with planned or anticipated effects, and describe in narrative format how well wildland fire objectives were met. Task number 16. Monitor, obtain, and record weather data. The bulleted item for this task is identify, observe, and record appropriate weather data such as mid-flame wind speed, wind direction, relative humidity, and other characteristics that influence fire behavior. Task number 17. Monitor and record fire behavior data throughout the fire management operation. The bulleted items for this task include observe and record appropriate fire behavior characteristics such as rate of spread, flame length, and residence time. Characterize and report the range of variability of first-order fire effects due to changes in fire behavior. Task number 18. Monitor and record smoke management information. There's one bulleted item pertinent to this unit. Recognize and report visibility problems. Fire managers often need information on fire behavior, weather, and fire effects during or immediately following a fire. While detailed information on fire effects are not always immediately available, detailed information regarding fire observations and fire conditions can and should be summarized soon after the fire or on a regular basis during longer incidents. This information may be used to refine prescriptions, strategies, and tactics over both the short and long term. This unit will introduce you to some example forms and formats you might find useful for reporting and summarizing your observations. Currently, there is no standardized format for fire monitoring reports and summaries, so you should check with your incident supervisor to determine which reports and summaries would provide the most useful information to the incident managers. For this course, we'll use an example format that works well to cover the information needed on most incidents. If you're assigned to an incident but haven't yet received complete instructions for monitoring requirements, this format will give you a place to start. The final exercise requires that you submit a fire monitoring summary containing the following elements: a map of the project area, observations of weather, fire behavior, and smoke, and a comparison of the predicted fire behavior, fire effects, and weather to the observed and prescribed parameters, a 1 to 2 page narrative discussing fire effects, success in meeting management objectives, and any follow-up actions needed. In this unit, we'll go over some existing forms and formats you can use for your final summary of the course exercise. Other units of this course will explain specifically how to collect the information needed. We'll also discuss some forms not required by the final exercise, but that you might find useful on other incidents to collect and submit additional information. The mapping unit of this course will explain in detail how to produce a field map. For the purposes of the final exercise for this course, an 8.5 by 11 topographic map from the burn plan will be provided. The map you submit in your summary must include scale, north arrow, date, author, legend, title, acres, and any other pertinent information, such as large-scale variability in fire severity. You can create your own hand-drawn map or mark the required information on the 8.5 by 11 map provided. Observations of fire behavior, weather, and smoke consist mainly of numeric values and short descriptions recorded multiple times during the incident. While you can record these observations in a notebook, on blank paper, or even on the cuff of your fire shirt, it's much easier and more professional to use existing forms to organize the observations. A PDF file of example forms used by the Interagency Wildland Fire Modules, formerly known as the Fire Use Modules, is provided on the course website. You should carry several sets of these or similar forms in your FEMO FOBS kit. On a fire incident, you may be provided with different forms that better meet the information needs of the incident, but most of the existing forms currently in use are very similar to these module forms. Information on how to gather the specific observations for fire behavior, weather, and smoke will be covered in the units on fire behavior, weather, and smoke observations. It is extremely useful to provide a comparison of the predicted fire behavior, weather, and fire effects to the conditions desired in the project plan and the conditions actually observed. This information can be used by fire managers, fire behavior specialists, and incident meteorologists to refine fire behavior and spot weather forecasts, modify firing patterns or management tactics, or adjust future prescriptions or project plans. There is no existing form for documenting this comparison, but fire monitoring instructions often require such a comparison. The Forms PDF file contains a form useful for this comparison. You don't need to fill out all the elements specified in this form. Use only the ones pertinent to the incident. The desired and acceptable values are part of the fire prescription and will be found in the project plan. The predicted or forecasted values will be in the spot or zone weather forecast and fire behavior briefing, while the observed values will come from the observations you log during the fire. Narratives are used when you must describe a situation in greater detail or provide information in addition to numeric observations. Your narrative for the final exercise must include the project name, date, location, and objectives. You can get all this information directly from the burn plan for the project. The required elements of the narrative for this exercise are observations of the fire effects of interest, a discussion of the extent to which management objectives were met, and follow-up actions required. Optional elements you may include in your narrative include other observations of relevant environmental conditions or fire effects and recommendations to management. We'll discuss some general information about the format of this narrative in this unit. More specific information on describing fire effects and evaluating management objectives is covered in the units on fire effects and management objectives. In documenting fire effects, focus on the resources and fire effects identified in the management objectives and describe the pre- and post-fire condition of the resource or attribute of interest, such as 100-hour fuel loading or scorch height of lodgepole pine. A photo can be very useful in illustrating fire effects if the location and the date and time of the photo is properly documented, and the photo itself is clearly focused with adequate resolution to show the pertinent details. Take a moment to look at this example fire effects narrative. As we discussed in the unit on management objectives, interagency prescribed fire policy requires that the monitoring summary for a prescribed fire contains a discussion of whether management objectives were met. We also saw in that unit that decision-making on wildfires is heavily dependent on the answer to this question. A short paragraph for each management objective, including any observations, measurements, or photos in support of your conclusion, is usually sufficient to meet this requirement. For instance, in the unit on management objectives, we used a project from the Florida Panther Refuge as an example. One of the objectives was consume 40 to 80% of the understory vegetation within wet prairie and pine habitat during each treatment. If this photo represents the post-burn conditions, an example narrative might read, the burn resulted in a patchy consumption of understory vegetation, with some limited areas experiencing nearly 100% consumption, in addition to small patches of unburned vegetation. Based on an ocular estimate, the treatment was successful in consuming 40 to 80% of the understory vegetation over the project area. While not required as part of the narrative, you can see how valuable a photograph can be in supporting your conclusions about the management objectives. Some information may not be immediately available when you are preparing your report, or some situations may require action on someone else's part. For instance, if limiting large tree mortality is one of the management objectives, it may be weeks or even months before tree mortality due to fire can be verified. Your narrative should point out that additional monitoring at a later date will be required to evaluate this objective. The Panther Refuge example had a treatment constraint to keep flame lengths less than 10 feet to limit overstory mortality. You can document flame lengths during the fire to evaluate this objective, But in your narrative, you might note that to verify resulting overstory mortality, another site visit several weeks after the fire would be necessary. Well, that covers all the required elements of the monitoring summary for the final exercise. But remember, there isn't a standardized format for monitoring summaries, and while the example format we're using in the S244 course will meet the needs of most assignments, you may be assigned to collect other information in addition to the elements we've just covered. In the next section of this unit, we'll discuss some other forms you might run across in your FEMO and FOBS assignments. As mentioned earlier, photos are useful for illustrating your narrative, supporting your observations, and documenting pre- versus post-fire conditions. Much of the information needed to identify the photo can be included in the photo itself and the timestamp feature of the camera, but keeping a log of your photos will keep the photo information organized and facilitate locating a specific photo. In the Environmental Observations unit, we'll discuss how to take fuel moisture samples. This form can be used to record and submit your results. The Fire Behavior Specialists and Plans section may require more detailed information about the fire behavior and perimeter than is documented in the Fire Behavior Observations form. This Fire Behavior Observations summary sheet is a useful resource for adding detailed narrative information to supplement your fire behavior observations. This summary sheet may be especially valuable to the fire behavior specialists on the incident if you submit it to them on a daily basis for use in calibrating their predictions. Note that under the new terminology for wildfire, the MMA, referred to in the last bullet point on the form, is now called the planning area, and trigger points are now called management action points. That covers most of the common forms and reports you will encounter as a fire effects monitor or field observer. To recap the requirements for the final exercise, your monitoring summary must include a field map of the project area with the acreage and the stand elements identified in the mapping unit, observations of weather, fire behavior, and smoke on datasheets completed during the burn, and a comparison chart of observed conditions versus the predicted and prescribed conditions, a 1 to 2 page narrative including the project name, date, location, and objectives from the burn plan, a discussion of observed fire effects, a discussion of the extent to which project objectives were met, and any follow-up actions required. If you wish, you may include other observations of relevant environmental conditions or fire effects, or recommendations to management in your narrative, but this isn't required for the final exercise summary. Remember that the monitoring summary for the final exercise is offered as an example. There is no standardized format for a monitoring summary. When you are assigned to an incident, work with your supervisor to determine what is needed for the monitoring summary, how often interim reports should be submitted, and to whom the reports should be submitted. You may be assigned to collect other information using different forms than we have discussed in this unit. Be flexible, and ensure that you receive and understand your instructions. Next are a few comprehension check questions. Again, these questions are not graded. Select an answer for the question and click Submit to check your answer. Click Next to move to the next question, or Previous to review or redo a question.